In the previous episode, I shared with you my process that I use for stripping this chest of drawers. Now, if you haven't seen that video yet, I will put the link below in the description. It's a good watch. In this episode, I'm going to sand it and prep it for finishing. So I'm beginning this project on the top, and what I'm using is a random orbital air sander, and I'm using 120 grit sandpaper, hook and loop in this particular situation. So in my shop, I tend to always use hook and loop. That you can get your disc sandpaper when you buy your random orbital sanders, especially like say for instance the air sander that I'm using. You can typically get them either in hook and loop or an abrasive back. Now, the abrasive back just it's a dirty environment, and it's just a little bit more difficult to keep that pad perfectly clean, so your abrasive always sticks great. So I don't use it typically. Sometimes in the finishing, I actually have one in my finishing room, but typically I'm going to use a hook and loop system. As far as sandpapers go, I won't really get into the different manufacturers of sandpaper in this particular video, but I typically use 120 grit in my initial sanding. That's pretty much across the board on almost every project. That's just my go-to grit, is 120. Now that would be on the on the raw wood after the stripping. So certainly you don't want to use 120 in the finishing process, but it's my first grit after stripping is going to be 120. So I'm using a pneumatic sander. You'll get the same results using an electric random orbital sander. So a pneumatic sander is definitely not necessary. It's just what I use a lot in my shop. Now, if you're going to consider using a pneumatic sander, you will need to match your air compressor to the sander. So they take a large compressor that puts out a large volume of air. Won't get into the specifics either of that on this particular video, but you do need a very large compressor with a large tank. Otherwise, your compressor will never be able to keep up with the sander, and you'll always be running out of air. Now, once I sand the side here, I'll just use this little detail sander just to kind of hit the corners that I'm not going to get with the round disc on the side. Now, for the most part, this piece was in really good shape, and there's not a whole lot of gouges and dents and stuff that I have to sand out. So I'm doing the feet on this one, and again, I'm using the orbital sander. Now I have really good control with this sander, a lot more so than my electric orbital sander. And it's relatively easy for me to do this because I've done it so many times. You want to kind of be careful if you sand a leg like this with these profiles, that you don't want to sand away the shape. So this is how I sand it, and if you were concerned about sanding it too aggressively, you could always back down like in sandpaper, or you can just sand it by hand. But I'm comfortable with my sander, so I'm able to sand this with the orbital sander and just take my time and make sure that I maintain the exact profile of the piece. I don't want to change that profile. I don't want to round it off at all. So I'm being nice and gentle and careful and sanding it with the orbital sander. Now, I do change my paper fairly often. So it's one of those things that time is money, and sanding a piece with a piece of sandpaper that's worn out. If I'm sanding wood with a piece of sandpaper that's worn out, it's going to take me twice as long to sand that. My hourly rate is a lot more than a piece of sandpaper, so I will change that sandpaper out as soon as it stops being aggressive. It might still feel like it has plenty of grit, but you definitely see a difference as far as the aggressiveness of that sandpaper. Once it gets that stage, I'm changing it out. So I'm now just sanding the drawers. I'm going to sand the insides of these drawers because I ran them through the strip tank, or well, the flow over tank. So since I ran it through the flow over system, I stripped the entire drawer. So I'll go ahead and kind of just give it a quick scuff on the inside. And I sanded this drawer face. Now the last thing I'll do on this face, on the drawer front, is I will hit the edges with a wooden block. Now I just sort of call this breaking the edges, because as you sand your surface, the flat face, it tends to make the edges sharp. If I hit them with the sander on these drawer fronts, I'd round it off just a little bit. So just take a block and just break those edges quick. So now on this little French chest, it has these, I don't really even know the exact name of this style where it has these peaks. So if you know what this style is called other than just French, where it has these peaks like this in the shape, drop us a note in the comments and let us know, because to be honest with you, I really don't even know what to call it. Now I'm taking my time here, and you'll see in this angle, I'm making sure that I don't sand the peaks. So what I'm doing is I'm going up on one side and then coming up on the other side, but I'm not putting any pressure on the peak of the drawer front itself, because I don't want to change that profile. So I'm just taking my time. I'm using a smaller orbital, which is 5 inches, and I'm just kind of going along with the profile the best that I can, so that I don't change it at all. Like I said, I don't want to put a lot of pressure on that peak and do anything to alter and change the shape of that peak. Now these pieces here, the drawer faces, they're solid wood. So being that they're solid wood, I'm not concerned, at least, about sanding through any veneer. So that's a bonus. Okay, now but for the rails between the drawers, I'm using the Roloc Bristle Discs. These are something that I use in the shop all the time. You can also just hand sand this. So I wouldn't necessarily, if you were doing one piece, I wouldn't go out and buy these, because they're kind of they're not cheap. But if you do any type of volume, these are, for me anyway, they're a must-have. So in this case right here, I'm using the yellow. Now I could just go ahead and I could sand this by hand, and it would be, just fine. It would probably just take me 3 or 4 times longer. So I knock it out pretty quick using these. A lot of times I'll follow these up with a little bit of hand sanding. You just want to make sure you use the right grit. Now I have videos on this on our website, so I'll drop a link below on how to use the discs. Then I'm just going to go over and do the edges. Since these are already rounded edges, I'm just hitting the edges. There are a couple little dings and dents that you can't necessarily see in the video, but they are there. So I'm hitting them with the orbital and just kind of breaking the edges and doing the top of the rail just with the orbital sander, just kind of to clean it up, So now these are just my techniques. This is how I do it on this particular piece. We do a lot of different types of furniture, and the techniques will vary from style to style and piece to piece. But, this is just how I go about it. And hopefully, you enjoyed this. Now, we're going to do in the next video finishing, and that's going to be a really cool video, because this piece is just not straight up refinishing. It's going to take a lot of shading in order to get these different colors, woods on the front to all blend. So definitely check that out. We'll hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you in the next one.